All right, on behalf of the Computer History Museum, the staff, the trustees, the volunteers, and the members, welcome to tonight's program. I'm Dan Lewin, I'm the CEO of the museum. I used to say that I'm pretty new here, but I'm not. It's almost 18 months now. I'm excited about that. And I'm particularly excited about tonight's program, which deals with some very profound issues at the intersection of technology and humanity, and the weaponization of our data for cultural and political warfare. So with that, I'm going to introduce Marguerite Gong Hancock, who's the founding director of our Exponential Center, and we'll kick off tonight's program, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks.
Good night, good evening. I'm delighted to add my welcome and to introduce tonight's program. Data has surpassed now oil as the world's most valuable asset. And our focus tonight is decoding the use, the misuse, and sometimes the abuse of data, especially our personal data on the internet. The great Hack Netflix documentary really lifted the curtain on our vulnerability and is raising questions that we're going to address tonight. What privacy do we give up when we tap our phone, our laptop, and share ourselves with the digital world? What have we learned from the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal? And what does it mean for our future? Has anything changed for the 2020 election? And how can we fight back? We have here tonight an unusual circle of people to discuss and debate these issues. First, Carroll Cadwallader is the investigative reporter from the Guardian who broke the story of Cambridge Analytica. And her work, which started with the first phone call to Chris Wylie that lasted 8 hours, then consumed her for 3 years and was the basis for the great hack. Karim Amir is an award-winning documentary filmmaker based in New York City, best known for producing in 2013 The Square, which received numerous Emmy Awards, as well as was nominated for an Academy Award. It is his great hack, premiered at the 2019 Sundance Film Festival and launched globally on Netflix this past July. Pedro Cos has been a director and editor of award-winning films for more than 15 years, and his editing on The Square won him an Emmy Award for Best Editing for a Nonfiction Program. He spent 3.5 years working on over 300 hours of material for the great hack. Last but not least, we're delighted to add to the panel Maricha Shaka, who is a cyber policy expert. While a member of the European Parliament for 10 years, she initiated the net neutrality law now in effect throughout Europe. She has a double appointment at Stanford, now as International Policy Director at the Cyber Policy Center, as well as a fellow at the university's Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. And to moderate, who could be better than John Markoff, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and a longtime business and technology reporter for the New York Times, as well as a longtime friend of the museum. He's also now writer-in-residence at the Stanford Center for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. To kick off tonight's evening, let's watch the trailer of The Great Hack.
Who has seen an advertisement that has convinced you that your microphone is listening to your conversations? All of your interactions, your credit card swipes, web searches, locations, likes, they're all collected in real time into $1 trillion a year industry.
The real game changer was Cambridge Analytica.
They'd worked for the Trump campaign and for the Brexit campaign.
They started using information warfare.
Cambridge Analytica claimed to have 5,000 data points on every American voter.
I started tracking down all these Cambridge Analytica ex-employees.
Someone else that you should be calling to the committee is Brittany Kaiser.
Brittany Kaiser, once a key player inside Cambridge Analytica, casting herself as a whistleblower.
The reason why Google and Facebook are the most powerful companies in the world is because last year data surpassed oil in value. Data is the most valuable asset on Earth.
We targeted those whose minds we thought we could change until they saw the world the way we wanted them to.
I do know that their targeting tool was considered a weapon.
There is a possibility that the American public had been experimented on.
This is becoming a criminal matter. When people see the extent of the surveillance, I think they're going to be shocked.
And I still fear for your life.
Yeah.
With the powerful people that are involved.
But I can't keep quiet just because it'll make powerful people mad.
Data rights should be considered just fundamental rights.
This is about the integrity of our democracy.
These platforms which were created to connect us have now been weaponized. It's impossible to know what is what, because nothing is what it seems.
Good evening, everyone. So let me just first say that since I was called in as a moderator at the last moment, I actually watched this documentary over the weekend, and I commend you guys. And I would really, if you haven't seen this, take the time. It's on Netflix, right? Is that where you can see it? It's worth it. This is about the question of whether democracy will survive the internet. And this is a good primer on that question. Let me start with Kareem and Pedro. Why don't you, since we're, it's frustrating we're not going to see the whole movie. It would be worth it to see the whole movie. We're going to see little bits and pieces. But why don't you guys start by telling us what you set out to do and give us a little précis on your documentary? Either, both?
Well, it's funny. We actually, Kareem and Jahan embarked on this project the end December 2014. It was. I came on about a year later. Originally, it was going to be a film on the Sony hack. When the whole story came out regarding the hack of the Sony studios and the everything that ensued, going up to basically Obama calling out North Korea and how now this information warfare was playing out between nation states. And as Kareem and Jahan set out to make that, the world started to change very rapidly. And when I came on board in late 2015, early 2016, things were moving quite fast, and then we saw the Brexit vote happen in the UK and the hack of the DNC. And after the election, we were really asking ourselves, well, this is the rabbit hole is a lot deeper here, where the great hack that we were looking into was actually the hack of our minds. And so we really wanted to dig into that, and we started to pivot and, trying to find the incredible stories and characters that could really unpack this world for us. And we met incredible Carroll here and the other characters through that process.
How did you guys run into each other? How did you meet Carroll?
How did we meet Carroll?
Yeah.
Well, we'd read about Cambridge and we were interested in this space, but it wasn't until Carroll wrote this brilliant piece, The Great Brexit Robbery, where she was able to really show the interconnectedness of this story on the global stage. And showed
March of 20, when was that?
So this was in 2017.
Something.
So it was kind of a year before we actually brought Chris Wiley.
So but you turned at that point and moved toward.
Well, we had started. We had read the Das magazine piece, and we were interested in that aspect. We were interested in Cambridge, but what Carroll did in her piece, which was really brilliant, was to show that in order to understand Brexit, you had to understand Trump. And to understand Trump, you had to understand Brexit. And when we started to see that it was the same players, different game, it was quite interesting to understand what was really happening here and how this vulnerability was being exploited across different countries. And so we connected with her. We met in London. And
but I didn't want to be a character in
She didn't want to be a character in the movie, though. Yeah.
But I introduced them to some other people who did become
some other
characters.
people, yeah, exactly.
But then you relented.
I kind of finally relented, yeah. It was sort of like a year later.
We're a little persistent.
Yeah, but we wouldn't give up.
I have to ask all four of you, nominally this is a documentary about Cambridge Analytica, but it's really about this advertising duopoly, and you're sitting here, you guys are all sort of, you're foreigners, right? You're two of you but you're foreigners to Silicon Valley.
Yes.
And you're sitting right at ground zero in between these two giant companies. What does it feel like?
We're sitting in the crime scene right now. Let's just call it what it is, right? I mean, it's the refuge and the crime scene. And I think that's kind of the uncomfortable thing we have to grow accustomed to. How can it be both?
Yeah.
I mean, look, I don't think we ever imagined that this conversation would get to the size that it's gotten to. So I think the fact that we're having this conversation is important, but I think we still have a long way to go. I think what's difficult for me as an immigrant to this country is to see that the ideals of the open society, which are the ideals that allow for multiculturalism, for democracy, for freedom of speech, for all of these things that we need and preserve. And coming from a place like Egypt, where I've seen what it means to not have those ideals in a society, that the people, in my opinion, there would be no Silicon Valley without those ideals. This entire valley would just be growing crops and no silicon, right? And if it weren't for those ideals, the engineers of the future wouldn't have a home. And yet, when you look at the leadership in this valley does not feel responsible for preserving those ideals. This valley is very comfortable with those societal losses that we see incurring on the balance sheet of the American democracy and democracies of countries afar, and not feeling an indebtedness to have to fix that. And I think that is not acceptable. I think that we have to really ask ourselves, what kind of society do we want to be engineering? How are the engineers of this country going to, how do they want to be looked at in the historic record?
Can I
Go ahead, Carol. I have a question I want to ask you.
I think it's such an interesting question and point that you raise there, and it is extraordinary if you think about it, that the future of my country right now was actually decided in the sort of 2-mile radius to here. And the fact that there is absolutely no accountability from these giant companies, which are just down the road, whose chief executive won't come to Britain to give evidence about what happened, who will not come to, I'm testifying in Dublin on Thursday to the Grand International Committee, which is 12 parliaments who've come together to look into this issue. I was asked to give evidence, and I am going to go and give evidence. Mark Zuckerberg was asked to go and give evidence, and he is not going to go and give evidence. And I really rather feel that his would be more valuable than mine. I'm all there's
so got. What was the starting point for you? How did you get onto this story?
Yeah, well, it's not funny at all. It's actually really, really deeply disturbing. And it starts with your absolutely neighborhood company, Google. And what happened is about 2 weeks after Donald Trump was elected, I was going to write this term fake news. We just learnt it. And that was that moment that Mark Zuckerberg said it was ridiculous. It was ridiculous, this idea that fake news could have had any impact. Anyway, and I got interested in Google. And I was just looking at, and then I got really curious because I was like, how does Google search actually work? And so I started toying around with search terms in the thing. And one of the first search terms I put into the Google box was the word Jews. And I thought, well, I'll make it into a question because that's what Google suggests you do. So I put, are Jews? And I got the drop-down list, of suggestions, are Jews? And the first suggestion it gave me was, are Jews evil? And I didn't even have to press return to get a whole page of results. Every single result said, yes, Jews are evil. And then, it gives you the suggestion of what to search for next. So the next suggestion was, did you want to look for, did the Holocaust happen? So I clicked on that link, and the top result I got was Stormfront, which is a Nazi website. And it said the Holocaust didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And I kind of always enjoy telling that story because I freaked out that evening when I looked at all these different search terms, and this was across a whole range of searches. It's the same with women. Women are, and it was again, evil. And it was this thing about, it gave the suggestion, every woman has a little degree of prostitute inside her. That was in the box at the top. And I do really find it worth going back to because it's this has been a very uncomfortable, difficult journey in all sorts of ways following this story. But it is going back to that evening of sort of there's something very, very strange had happened on the internet in that year.
You talked about how these organizations feel like monoliths and they feel like they're at this point planetary. But we've been through this over and over again over the sweep of technology in this country with IBM, well, AT&T and IBM and Microsoft. And maybe it's not forever. What does it look like from a regulatory point of view? And is Facebook eternal?
Well, I think we first have to acknowledge, and I think the Great Hack shows this very, very clearly with great figures. Your work has really been groundbreaking. I think all of your work in bringing this story to a much larger audience, because this is about all of us, not only Americans, not only Silicon Valley, not only Facebook, but it is indeed about the question of power. And I think no one will deny anymore that these companies, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Apple, that they're all very, very powerful. And I think the fundamental question is, where does the control of that power come from? Where do checks and balances come from? And how do we break through this argument that has really shaped also the regulatory discussion for, I would say, the past 2 decades, that regulation would stifle innovation? I mean, as a member of the European Parliament, I heard lobbyists making that argument over and over and over again. And we're still not at a healthy point of saying, we're going to engage in the question of regulation, starting unequivocally with the notion that the rule of law, democracy, and human rights must not and never be disrupted, no matter which technology, no matter which company. Yeah. And I think that should be our starting point when we think about regulation, not the kind of technology, not the company, not regulating the internet, which is often a kind of phrase that comes about. We need to step away from this sort of exceptional notion that technology is very different than any other sector. We regulate for food safety, child safety. They don't want to swallow small parts of toys. The ceiling is not supposed to fall on us. And similarly, technology should be bound by some principles that I think we're pretty clear about in the democratic world. It's under pressure from all sides, also in the quote-unquote offline world. So this whole question of data as a huge power source to influence people, to hack people's minds, has to be checked and balanced.
Yeah. Isn't the automotive industry kind of the evidence against that technology regulation hurts innovation? I mean, didn't safety and efficiency come from regulation in the automotive industry?
Oh, I hope I wasn't unclear, because I don't believe that regulation hurts innovation.
Yeah,
it's the argument that the tech lobbyists use. But I think you can see over and over again, even Microsoft is quite ironic. It's one of the most powerful companies in the world, and it was met with antitrust cases. There were questions 20 years ago, are they going to survive? Of course, there will be regulation, and I don't think the question should be, oh, what if a company doesn't survive? It's not even relevant in many ways. You want to create a level playing field where competition is fair, where rights and freedoms are protected, where also smaller players, you mentioned, or in the introduction was briefly mentioned, net neutrality. I think this notion of competition is also still vital for breaking through the power of these big companies that are vacuuming up data.
everywhere.
Breaking is part of the problem.
Which
breaking? I think this culture in this valley of break everything, and everything you break, you make better.
Yeah.
This constant disruption thing. You know, some things aren't yours to break, like democracy, right? Like, I mean, like who's told? Like, you know, or Britain, you know, it's like move fast and break things. Well, if you break it, you should pay for it. Yeah. And I don't think I mean, last time I checked, right? So, you know, I see a lot of billionaires in this city, and I see $5 billion fine where the stock price goes up. You know, I think if you added a zero, as Kara Swisher said, we'd have a very different conversation. If you wanted technology companies to be accountable, hold them to account. Yeah. Right? I mean, this idea that we don't know how to stop the fake news. Well, I think this city is full of a lot of bright people. If there was an incentive to fix it, they would fix it. But I don't see an incentive, and I think
it's not built for that.
Exactly.
So, last week you were at Stanford. You were in conversation with Eric Schmidt. He basically made this argument that we shouldn't regulate AI too early. And it was
Who's surprised here? I want to see hands. Yeah.
What was your reaction?
Well, you know, I always smile when I hear people saying, no, it's too early for regulation, because when it comes to fake news and disinformation disruption, or the undermining of our democracy, rather, everybody concludes maybe we were too late. So I would rather be too early for once, especially as the European Union. It's often accused of being slow and, you know, technology outpacing it. So I think there is a way to walk in step with innovations such as artificial intelligence, but it requires that there's also access to information in the public interest. Because oftentimes tech executives will say, oh, politicians can only make these very lousy regulatory proposals because they don't know how technology works, and often half of the room laughs. But it's really not something to be quite amused about. It's something to be worried about, and it's also the consequence of opaque algorithms. Intransparent use of data, as the Great Hack also shows, a total lack of oversight. So we have to break the cycle of the notion that politicians or regulators more broadly don't know enough about the technology. That is in fact the problem that needs to be addressed. Because if we don't know what goes on under the hood of these very powerful technologies, then it is impossible to make well-informed policies as a result.
Let me ask about that. So we'll step way back. It's 1957. Vance Packard has written a book called The Hidden Persuaders. So what's new?
The Hidden what?
He wrote a book, this is the statesman. He wrote a book called The Hidden Persuaders. It was about using mass media to manipulate people.
Mass media.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
And how does it work differently?
Because, I mean, in the last election, if you used Facebook or you used an internet browser, then it's quite likely that you might have seen a political ad. But the political ad that you saw was not the one that your neighbor saw, or even your wife or your husband saw. Mm-hmm. Or it was based upon this set of data, some set of information about you. You've got no idea what information that was. Yeah. And whatever you were told in that advertisement just vanished after you saw it. And there's no record of it, there's no archive. What amazes me about the 2016 election here, that how many millions of words have been written about that election, and yet we haven't actually got the first idea of what happened in it, because that election took place online. It took place predominantly on Facebook, and those ads have been lost to history, or at least Facebook servers. And they haven't been produced. I mean, we got some of them out of Facebook in Britain, and they were shocking. I mean, the racism, the explicit racism and fear-mongering in them was really, really shocking. It was at a tiny scale compared to what's going on here, and you haven't even seen any of them. The way that Facebook, we know that the Trump campaign was using Facebook to suppress African American votes, for example. That's what they said that they were going to do.
Well, and more elections are decided on very slim differences. So we sometimes think about, or we hear debates about fake news, like, can people be persuaded by one message or another? But it's not even about that. It's about voter suppression. It's about possibly changing 1.5%, 2%
Yeah.
of people's minds. I think it's always striking to look at the measles outbreaks that are suddenly happening in this country. There's no scientific or medical reason for it, but it's because people are meant to believe that vaccinations are harmful for their children. And even a very, very small percentage of people persuaded by #1 recommendations on Amazon of books like Melanie's Marvelous Measles that imply that having measles is a phenomenal thing for a child to experience. These crazy rankings also on Google and YouTube and whatnot of conspiracies and the like, even a small percentage of outbreaks of measles can actually have a huge public health impact. And I think we need to think about the impact of this disinformation similarly, that it really spreads like ink through the system.
Let me ask a very basic question and see if there's consensus. Do all of you agree that Cambridge Analytica's work on Facebook played a meaningful role in the outcome of the 2016 Trump election? Did it tip the election?
Well, the fact is, we absolutely do not know.
Exactly.
That is the key fact of
Do you
it,
think
because
Facebook
that
knows?
information is locked inside a private company.
Does
And
Facebook
that-
know?
Facebook knows.
Yeah.
So Facebook, of course, it has the evidence, and it has declined to open that up to the public. And it's the same in our election in Britain. It's the same. You remember, pretty much every country in the world's elections are running through the private company just down the road from here, where they are locked inside that private company forever. Now, this cannot go on. This cannot stand. And this, I think, is the key change that has to happen. This has to become part of the public commons because it belongs to us, the public. It is our elections. These are our countries. This is our data. It's our evidence. And it is not okay that Facebook has this and Google also, and they have not produced it.
But I think it also shows their perspective is one in which we are a commodity and everything is for sale. I think that is a fundamental problem, is that everything's for sale. And there is nothing that is sacred anymore. And if you're making money off disinformation, great. You know, if you're getting more users, who cares? If you're getting more people to watch YouTube, even if it means they're watching ISIS videos, that's great, as long as they're watching, right? I mean, it is the ugly face of a tech fascist capitalist approach that is really dangerous. And I think it goes against the entire spirit of the utopian perspective that this valley initially had. I think it shows a very kind of different view of the world, one in which technology is not built to serve and be designed for us, but is designed to actually just commoditize us further and further. And that's by choice. What's upsetting is these are all human choices. This is not the machines taking over. No, these are our choices where we are choosing balance sheet success over any societal success.
This has actually been debated in Silicon Valley for some years. Are you familiar with the term blitzscaling? This is a term of art that was posed by Reid Hoffman in the last year, making essentially that argument, that it's essentially the Larry Ellison argument. It's not enough to win, everybody else must die. But Tim O'Reilly, who's another longtime Silicon Valley person, pushed back on it. There is a perspective in the Valley that maybe it's okay for companies to grow organically rather than being hugely venture funded and destroying all their competition before anybody has a chance to compete. We're going to have to show some clips unless we talk the whole time. But I want, before we go that one step farther, I want to ask you, if we exclude Carroll, you guys have drawn two really remarkable portraits that we sadly won't get to see of two whistleblowers from Cambridge Analytica, Brittany Kaiser and Chris Wiley. It's really quite remarkable. They both published books this month. Is this story going to go on? Did they break news in their books? Is there more of their tale?
Well, I haven't had a chance. The books just came out. I haven't, honestly, but I think there is some new information in both novels. So.
Shall I? I mean, essentially, we're not even at the start of the story yet. I mean, the scandal was one thing, but it's the cover-up You know, we always say it's not the crime, it's the cover-up. Cambridge Analytica is a cover-up. And this, I think, is the thing which is going to now unravel. I don't know if any of you saw the questioning of Mark Zuckerberg by Congress last week, and particularly the questions by Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. And she asked, you heard her ask, when did you actually know about Cambridge Analytica? And did you see Mark Zuckerberg take the drink of water and say that he couldn't quite remember and he wasn't really sure? Well, I don't think that's the end of that story. And I think that the answers that Mark Zuckerberg gave to Congress more than a year ago about Cambridge Analytica, we now know that a lot of that really doesn't look true. Yeah. And I know that there's not much accountability left in the world, but I wonder if there's a bit in terms of...
We'll find out.
Well, and it should also ignite new processes of accountability, not just hearings. That should also be, you said we haven't even started. I think in also accountability in a more systematic way. It cannot depend on hearings and whether CEOs show up or not. It must be across the board also impacting the companies that don't have consumer brands, which, you know, critical stories are now written about. There's a whole industry that is much less visible, and I think people in this part of the world know very well, that are also part of this ecosystem of disruption that touches the heart of our democracy. And I wanted to spend 1 second, because we're indeed a number of non-Americans, and maybe that's a good thing to repeat sometimes, but that a lot of the effects that are described in the movie about the UK and the United States are very, very severe. But you know, I saw with my own eyes when I was the chief observer of the EU election observation mission in Kenya, what the impact of such disinformation was in a country with a history of election violence and a much less mature media landscape and a willingness to ignite violence between people. So it's also very important when we think about consequences that we think globally.
Okay. Let's play the second clip, if we could.
The Brexit work. I'd started tracking down all these Cambridge Analytica ex-employees. And eventually, I got one guy who was prepared to talk to me. Chris Wiley. We had this first telephone call, which was insane. It was about 8 hours long, and
my name is Christopher Wiley. I'm a data scientist, and I helped set up Cambridge Analytica. It's incorrect to call Cambridge Analytica a purely sort of data science company or an algorithm, company. It is a full-service propaganda machine.
Tell us a little bit about Chris Wiley. First of all, how did you find your way to Chris?
I found my way to Chris because I wrote my first big piece about Cambridge Analytica about Robert Mercer, the billionaire who owned it, in February 2017. And we already knew a lot then, so I wrote about this, the harvesting of Facebook data in that article. There'd already been other ones. But I was then, you just hit a dead end. That's the thing, because the companies, Facebook in this instance, just wouldn't give me any straight answers. They refused to answer my questions. I was like, well, what happened to that investigation? What happened, with the Cambridge Analytica? And you just hit these brick walls. And then what was bizarre was I found that there was this connection to this other company another company had worked in the Brexit campaign, a little data company on an island off the west coast of Canada. And I got this tip-off that actually they were connected to Cambridge Analytica as well. So I was like, what is going on here? And so that was when I was like, and I started going through LinkedIn and trying to find ex-employees. And eventually that led me to one person who would talk to me. And when I sort of started talking about Facebook, he said, you've got to find Chris Wiley.
Was he just waiting for you to find him?
He totally was waiting for me to find him. He was like, oh, he sort of said, you're the first journalist who's called me. You're the first journalist who's called me. And it was because his name was in nowhere on the, I mean, he's clever, Chris, and there was no connection with him to the company anywhere on the internet. I mean, he was not, there was not an obvious way to have known about him or to have found him. But there was like the great uncorking when he did start talking. I mean, then you couldn't stop him talking. I mean, that was my problem for a year.
And there's
no, I'm doing the washing up, just like, yeah.
There's this moment in the film where Chris says to a British committee, you should talk to Brittany Kaiser. Did he out Brittany Kaiser, or he outed Brittany Kaiser?
Yeah.
That's remarkable.
He was the first one to mention it.
So, I mean, what happened? Shall I tell what happened the day before that Brittany Kaiser came forward as a whistleblower, and then maybe you take on the story? So the day before Brittany Kaiser emerged as a whistleblower, I wrote a story about this particularly illegal, divisive, racist, violent election in Nigeria. And I wrote about how Cambridge Analytica had been involved in hacking, working with a team of Israeli hackers who had hacked the private emails of the presidential candidate and then had leaked them to the press. Now, if that sounds familiar, just stop me there. And one of the people's names who came up in that connection with that campaign and who directed some of the work around that hacking, was Brittany Kaiser. And so we published that story, and then the next day she emerged as a whistleblower. And then it was very shortly after that, wasn't it, that you met her?
How did you find her?
So I was connected to her through the person you meet in the film, Paul Hilder, who had been working with her and another person at The Guardian, Paul Lewis. And they Paul had been working kind of with Brittany for several months. He'd also found her on LinkedIn and had started kind of slowly kind of getting her to talk about things that she had been a part of. And I met Paul, and he was like, there's this woman, she pitched the Trump campaign, and she wrote the Trump contract. I was like, what? He's like, yeah, and she's been there for a while, and her nickname is Brexit Brittany. I was like, okay. He's like, she's in Thailand. I was like, okay. He's like, you gotta go tomorrow. I was like, okay. And he's like, and she used to work on the Obama campaign. I was like, okay, this is crazy.
Yeah.
And so I was in London, and because at that time, the Carroll's piece and Chris had just come out, and Chris had just testified before Parliament. And I called my wife and partner, Jahan, who also directed the film, and I was like, should I go to Thailand? She's like, I don't know, really? Are you sure this is a real thing, or you just want to go to Thailand? I was like, no. None of us believe there was no Kareem. Come on, this is like, Kareem's going to Thailand to meet this person. I was like, and then I went to Thailand.
You got great stuff.
Yeah,
it was worth the trip.
It was worth the trip, and the first time I met Brittany was in the pool.
Yeah.
And the thing is, when you meet people like this, you don't really know where the road's going to take you. You don't know if they're going to change their mind the next day and say, I don't want to talk anymore. So you kind of treat every day like it's your last day.
Yeah.
We went on the ride together.
These are they were incredibly interesting psychological profiles. And I mean, I start from the point of asking you, these do not seem like people, either Wiley or Kaiser, whose political values line up with Trump, Bannon, or Mercer. So how do you pick apart what they were doing there? How did that happen?
Well, I think the thing with Chris is that he's incredibly bright, and he loves ideas, and he got really fixated on this, really interested in the research on personality and political partisanship and how you might be able to construe that through people's Facebook profiles. And he just thought this was a really interesting idea, I think, and read all the papers and then went off to meet these psychologists at Cambridge University. And I think, he he just got caught up in the idea. And the sort of disaster of it was that he met Alexander Nix, who was able to action that idea, who suddenly, came up, they got the investor, Robert Mercer, met Steve Bannon, and suddenly they had millions of dollars to play with and to experiment with that and see if that worked. And, it was I think it was this sort of experimental idea of what's possible without thinking, well, is that something desirable? Is that possible, something, which you'd actually want to happen?
Yeah.
And I think it took him a long time to ask that question.
I mean, I think it's a classic innovation story.
I know, it's almost a metaphor for everything.
Yeah. Exactly. It's like, I've met several people who worked at Cambridge, and I would not tell you that the majority of them are conservative or liberal. I don't think it was about that. I think people were attracted to, they had some of the best data scientists in the world who were attracted to working there because people felt that they could actually get to try out their ideas and experiment and explore and do things. So in the name of innovation, a lot of blurry lines were crossed and a lot of ethical boundaries were crossed. And I think it is a cautionary tale, and that is in a way why we chose it as this kind of framing for the film, because in this story, you could see how, in many ways, some of the big questions we're asking now, which is just because something wasn't illegal when you did it, because so often our legal frameworks are usurped by the tech innovation, doesn't mean it's right, doesn't mean it's okay. And if you're innovative in the name of innovation, if you disrupt fundamental things that are quite damaging, who's accountable? Mm-hmm. Who pays for it? But ultimately, with Cambridge Analytica being gone, the film takes you to the reality of Facebook, which many people realize is there would be no Cambridge Analytica story without Facebook. Facebook was the weapon. Cambridge Analytica just knew how to pull the trigger, and I think that's an important thing to understand, that with all the talk about Cambridge coming and going, we still are left with the reality of this fragility that this story exposed us to, and not much has changed to protect us, and that really concerns us.
And Brittany was kind of like a billiard ball. She started with Obama, she ended up in the heart of the Trump world, and then now she's doing open data, right? She's like gone all the way over. What did you end up feeling about Brittany?
Well, listen, I think we can all question and discuss what Brittany's motivations were, but I also think Brittany's a mirror in many ways to where we are and who we are as a society. And I think we have to start, you can ask and we can debate her motivations all day long, but she did come forward with a lot of information. And she has been collaborating with a lot of investigations on both sides of the Atlantic. Yeah. And I think, whether one way or another, but she did start questioning in many ways, and I think we have to give credit. I think we do need more Brittany Kaisers in many ways in this town and in all industries, I think.
Did you guys go after Alexander Kogan, the guy who was the middleman, the data broker? Is he spoken?
I met Alexander Kogan. He was kind of, at the time he didn't want to go on camera, but we spoke. His position is that he didn't do anything wrong, and he was just this academic, and he was just trying to, that he was kind of bamboozled by them.
He argues he was thrown under the bus by Facebook.
Yeah, and that everybody kind of just, blamed him. I don't know. I think enough has been said about Kogan to answer his own thing. But again, I think it's, I think all these actors, there are many actors in this story that you could kind of blame it on innovation, right? But at the same time, this is a defense military contractor that that owned Cambridge Analytica, the SCL group that was behind this. So, the question is asked, you knew where you were working. You weren't working at the Boy Scouts, right? This was So I think we have to kind of ask ourselves what the Faustian deal looks like. In the name of innovation, what are we willing to compromise? And I think that is a larger tale.
Well, and there's, I think, two sides of that. On the one hand, there's a big paradoxical contrast between, on the one hand, the promise, even in the AI discussion, the promise of the great things that these technologies are going to bring. And then when you ask a question also with the, the huge sophistication of selling ads, sort of the core business model. And then when there's questions about democracy, often the answer is, well, we don't really know. We still have a lot to learn, even though there's been learning going on at such a sophisticated level, it's just not a convincing argument. And so I think one of the takeaways from the great hack is also that every individual has agency. I mean, if it wasn't for individuals who stepped forward here and who chose to do something quite challenging and quite courageous, is to speak. Similarly, all the people here who are very bright, who work for these companies because they want the opportunities and the exciting innovations, I am convinced that they are more and more asking themselves questions, where do I want my talent to go? And I really think that that kind of conscious decision by every person, whether it's a CEO or a coder somewhere, deeply involved in the making of the technical products, everybody has a choice. And I think that choice may well be, the choice of talent that the companies need to attract may well be the biggest game changer that we're going to see, because people don't want to be involved with companies that have such devastating reputations.
Well, this is interesting. So, you use words like information warfare, psyops, weaponized technology, but at the same time, you tell a story where these guys are actually, it seems like, out ahead of the military guys and the spy guys. It seems like they're inventing technologies to manipulate humans that have nothing to do with the way these technologies have been used traditionally, or these information warfare campaigns have been used in the past. These guys are in new territory. The technology is actually being developed for consumer applications, not for warfare.
That's very dangerous.
The tail is wagging the dog, isn't it?
Well, there's more and more civilian use of military-grade technologies. And again, across the board, there's a lack of oversight. And at the same time, because there's so much digitization, that also means privatization, governments are less and less empowered, like factually capable of developing the services, the infrastructure, the protection of them in the cyber domain. And you can even see the questions of, monopoly of the use of force. When you have more and more offensive capabilities in the cyber domain that companies can deploy and are sometimes deliberately outsourced to companies. So think about the Blackwater model, that it's deliberately outsourced to a private company. So there are a lot of very, very fundamental questions about technology development and the impact on the rule of law in its very principal terms.
So there's two other characters. Julian Wheatland, who was, I think, was he the COO or CTO? COO of Cambridge. You got him on film, which was very impressive. What did you take away from, I mean, he felt defensive, but he was candid to an extent, it seemed like. What's the backstory on your interview with him?
I mean, Julian, look, I think Julian came, it was a last minute addition to the film. We'd been trying to get access to him and Alexander Nix for a long time, and they were not really interested. And then Julian, right before kind of we were finishing, agreed to meet us, and then we spoke. And I think Julian is is a representative of a very cautionary tale. It's like, at a certain point, Cambridge Analytica had so much incredible brand recognition and was following a strategy of, basically they were trying to parlay their experience in political ad tech and use it to go into the consumer space. And it was a strategy that was working, and they had just been behind two of the most unexpected political outcomes in Western history, Brexit and the Trump campaign, right? So they had such brand recognition, and where he was sitting, they were on top of the world, as he says in the film. And they were starting to go into all the consumer brands. And it was interesting to see how much every single consumer brand was calling Cambridge after the election, because they wanted a piece of this magic, this special sauce that they had. And he never imagined that it would crash and burn in this way. So I think, again, it is an interesting mirror and reflection of so many CEOs or COOs in these types of innovative environments who kind of in the name of innovation, cross and break and don't think about any kind of ethical boundary whatsoever, and are left with this kind of reality of a mess to clean up.
Yeah.
So Julian was an important contribution to it.
And then you didn't get Alexander Nix, but you did because of the Channel 4 coverage, which is really worth the price of admission for this movie by itself. I mean, you have to see this. Do you believe the things he said in that hidden camera footage were true, or was he embellishing?
I mean, I can't speak for Alexander's truth-telling.
Well, what do you think?
I think his idea of the truth is a very interesting one, I'd say.
I think, for example, we absolutely know for certain that in an election in St. Kitts, I think it was 2010, Cambridge Analytica set up their own sting, a bit like the Channel 4 sting, in which they set up a hidden camera in a hotel room and turned up with a suitcase of cash and asked the candidate, the Prime Minister candidate, if they would take this cash, and they filmed it, and then they released it onto the internet. And so would that team who did that also be possible of flying in a free prostitutes to try it by another method? I think that doesn't seem like a huge stretch of the imagination, does it?
That sort of dials from market research toward propaganda, doesn't it?
But I think, the thing is about it, this is the sort of crazy thing about it, is Alexander Nix said to me that they worked in 154 elections around the world. I mean, the scale of this, it's kind of electoral subversion at an industrialized scale across the world. And again, we know almost nothing about any of them.
There were two timelines that we used kind of to help frame the making of the film. And Pedro and I, when we were trying to figure it out, it was like, you have to understand the way in which ad tech works and the history of ad tech to some degree, and you have to understand psyops, psychological operations as they exist. And only when you understand both of those and then see how they come together in the Cambridge Analytica story can you get a complete picture of how this works. And I think it's important to see in this story that, coming from the Middle East, we're used to being the petri dish where a lot of the world powers experiment on the populations, in the name of liberating people and finding weapons of mass destruction and all these things, right? So, and a lot of these PSYOP techniques were really expanded in the post 9/11 days, right, and era. With the war on terror. A lot of the contracts that Cambridge Analytica was able to get in the name of fighting terror, companies like the SCL Group profited a lot of these types of psychological experiments on different native populations around the world. So, but what's interesting in this story and why it's another cautionary tale from that lens is that the hens have come home to roost in a way, right? Like all these things that we experimented on in the developing world, never imagine them coming back to the UK and to the US and being used on local populations. Yeah. A lot of these technologies were allowed to happen because they were being used outside, but they were never supposed to go domestic. And I think that's an important thing we have to look at when we see, again, what other technologies now are being experimented on in the developing world because there's no regulation, which can be called an innovation opportunity, right? These are the ethical questions we have to ask outside of the Cambridge Analytica world and across the overall space of how technology is affecting us.
And up until 2015, correct me if I'm wrong, Carroll, it was a technology that in the UK was considered a weapon. It was not supposed to be used on domestic, on the domestic population.
And what, I'm kind of curious what you think about it, John, because being, a very long-term technology reporter based here, this was a story, the technology story, that wasn't broken here or in America. And it was, I was for a long time considered a conspiracy theorist. Cambridge Analytica wasn't doing anything special. It was just snake oil. It didn't even work. This was the sort of, for more than a year, a lot of the press coverage, certainly in America. And I don't know, do you think that maybe this thing of actually you need to have these other perspectives and other cultural views, also sort of reflecting upon what's going on here and maybe seeing it differently.
We're extremely insular here in Silicon Valley. That's one thing I know. Let's continue that conversation in the context of the next clip, because we're stepping through this and I want to get through all of them, but I hold on to that and I'll try to respond better.
So we always spend the majority amount of money on any commercial or political campaign in Facebook. Always gets the majority of the ad budget.
It does.
Yeah.
It does. There is at least the possibility that the American public and publics in other countries had been experimented on.
Remember those Facebook quizzes that we used to form personality models for all voters in the US? The truth is, we didn't target every American voter equally. The bulk of our resources went into targeting those whose minds we thought we could change. We called them the persuadables. They're everywhere in the country, but the persuadables that mattered were the ones in swing states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Florida. Now, each of these states were broken down by precinct. So you can say there are 22,000 persuadable voters in this precinct. And if we targeted enough persuadable people in the right precincts, then those states would turn red instead of blue.
So let's drill down on that point. 80,000 votes, 3 states. You can read very well-argued you can read arguments on both sides. You can read an argument that says that Cambridge Analytica did not make the difference in those 3 states. Did it? Is there evidence one way or another? I mean, clearly it was a razor-thin margin. Clearly there was an effort to suppress votes, but maybe it was done by the Internet Research Agency instead of Cambridge Analytica.
Well, but then we go back to, again, that's exactly the same question, because so after a struggle, the Facebook gave up the Russian ads to Congress. And I did an event 3 weeks ago with Adam Schiff, who was the chair of the committee which got those ads. And he said, but we didn't get the Trump campaign's ads. And we weren't able to get them. And we hoped that Robert Mueller was going to get them and that we would know whether they overlapped. Did the data that the Russians were using to target voters, was there any overlap with what the Trump campaign was doing? And that is, it is this, Facebook is the crime scene. But yet the data, the evidence doesn't seem to, the actual evidence where there would be or could be collusion doesn't, we've got no idea if that's even been looked at.
And the problem is that the people who do, none of us are technologists. I mean, you probably more than we are, but the 3 of us are not technologists. We had to figure out what questions to even be asking, right? But the people who do know the questions, our citizens in this valley, right? The people who could actually know, if you want to know what happened, here's the questions to ask, are in this valley. Yet we don't see until, except last week, this open letter from Facebook employees. Where are the thousands of people who work in this company who know what questions should be asked? Where is that sense of urgency?
Well, and also where's the next iteration of these efforts? Because we're still stuck, quote unquote, and for good reasons, because we don't have all the answers, we don't have all the data, we don't have all the information about 2016, but it's no longer a neatly divided sort of foreign operations, domestic operations. It all blends into each other. There are new technologies like videos that can be made to look like people say things in their own voice that they have actually never said, deep fakes that can mislead people. So, I really urge people to see this movie as a wake-up call and to think, what is the next wave we have to anticipate? And what can we do now to avoid a repeat of the Brexit and the US elections? And it's actually, as such, a very problematic notion that we're sitting here and that the information about what actually happened, it's unknown. It's unknown to journalists who've dug, like years and years and years. It's unknown to politicians who are supposed to defend our democracy because it's the most precious thing we have.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember that this is not, as Carroll says in the film, this should not be seen as a partisan issue. This is about the fundamental mechanism by which our democracy is run by, the integrity of our information systems. I mean, all the technologists in this room know that without authentication, right, without the authentication mechanisms, there is no internet systems, right? Without being able to know what is authentic, what isn't, you can't land on a page, right? So the authentication systems of our democratic process have been fundamentally broken. And yet we are treating that as a partisan issue, and that in itself is very problematic.
It's a success for those who want to undermine the trust and the participation in democracy. It's like the next level of success, because if the defense of democracy is becoming a polarizing issue, if you want to ruin democracy, that's a home run.
And that's why we called the film The Great Hack, because a hack is an exploitation of a vulnerability, right? And I think we have to look back at what is that vulnerability that is being exploited, and how can that vulnerability be exploited by people outside of this country as well, people who aren't blue or red, right? And how are we comfortable with that kind of exploitation continuing to be happening?
What's remarkable is that we really should have, I'm talking as a Silicon Valley person here now, been sensitive to this possibility much more than we were. I mean, I think most people in this room, or a fair number of them, grew up on a genre of science fiction called cyberpunk, a very dystopian way of looking at the world. And yet we had this notion, this sort of John Perry Barlow notion, that somehow cyberspace would be different, that it would be this sort of pure place, and it turned out not to be. For me, I was in the science section of the Times in 2012, and some Facebook researchers published a paper with some UCSD researchers about their ability to affect people's propensity to vote. And it appeared in Nature. It was a scientific article. And I wrote a very sort of feel-good article about that without thinking about the flip side. If you can persuade people to vote, you probably can dissuade people from voting too, which was obvious at the time. So there's a story to the button, isn't there? I mean, there's a broader story to the button?
Yes, so a journalist called Hannes Grasseger, who's Swiss, who was one of the first people to write sort of substantially about Cambridge Analytica, he did a long story last year about the button, because he got very curious about it, which was do you know, on election day in the United States, there's an option on Facebook of saying, I voted. But it's really weird because they deploy this in some countries, but not in other countries. And I believe even there was that in some states, but not other states. And it's only supposed to be people over the age of 18 who are voters who get it. But of course, there's lots of people with the wrong ages, etc. But as you say, we know that has an impact. It has a contagious effect, but it's being controlled by this company, which totally isn't accountable, and we don't know who's seeing it. So, I mean, that's just one small example. But
they use this term persuadables. They look at people who sort of are on the fence, but there's not clear evidence that you can actually. I mean, there's a lot of skepticism that you can use a Facebook impression to move a person from one side to the other. I mean, there's not clear evidence yet.
But there is clear evidence that you can use Facebook to persuade people in their decisions of what they buy every day.
Exactly.
If there wasn't, Facebook wouldn't be a multi-billion. Their only revenue is advertising, right? So if Facebook, I think when people always ask, like, what's the proof that Facebook works? I'm like, their business model. That's the proof. The proof, like if Facebook and Google didn't work in persuasion, they wouldn't have any business. I mean, that is the fundamental thing that they do. It is an ad tech surveillance company. That is what it does. So, the idea that that if you don't believe that, then you don't believe advertising works at all, right? And that's a whole other conversation. So,
and also young people access information through social media almost exclusively. And so whether they even get exposed to journalist content or, only entertainment or games and other sorts of things will also determine whether they're informed, whether they are aware of their rights to vote. It's multi-layered, I think. Yeah. And if there's not an ability to research this independently, then there's a growing asymmetry between the public interest and access to information to serve the greater good and access to information to serve and feed the business models. And of course they are a proof of how well it's working. I fully agree with that.
You brought up the issue of deep fakes, and there is the possibility that this is more of a Potemkin village than we know. We were talking about fake accounts before we started. Facebook has this transparency portal now. They acknowledge that the number of fake accounts that are created and which they find has gone up dramatically, which is a striking fact to me, that they're now acknowledging over 2 billion fake accounts a quarter that they take down. And they say that they get all but 5%. And we have to trust them on that to believe that. But what if the technology for creating fake accounts is out ahead of Facebook? What then?
Well, I think we can be fairly sure that Facebook itself has been gamed to some extent. Yeah. I mean, that people have reverse engineered or understood or used their knowledge from other, from PsyOps to use the advertising platform for a variety of reasons that may or may not have been the intention. But I also am a bit cautious to see every sort of malign outcome as an abuse, because some of the outcomes are actually the normal use, and it really depends on the imagination of the people who are driving the race of this innovation to assess what the possible negative outcome could be. And if you have a global company and you make money globally, then you also have to be mindful of local context. I can't stress it enough. I mean, look at the huge challenge we have in understanding this problem here in the United States, and imagine, and we know the impact that Facebook had in hate speech, incitement to violence in countries like Myanmar, where there were a total of 0 employees on the ground. So it's also about how much effort are you going to take to actually optimize for democracy or optimize for human rights, optimize for peaceful behavior, optimize against disinformation and hate speech, or how much revenue or resources you're going to put towards the latest ad innovation or better micro-targeting of, I don't know, the next shirt to the next teenager.
Let's watch the last clip.
Carroll tweeted, Prof. Carroll also giving evidence to European Parliament today on day of deadline for Cambridge Analytica to turn over his data to him. If it fails to do so, it becomes a matter for criminal proceedings. Hey, Ravi. Have you heard anything? Not yet. I've been waiting to hear from my lawyer, and we have heard nothing. And so they have not respected the regulator. They are not respecting the law. So now that this is becoming a criminal matter, we are now in uncharted waters. And I will continue to pursue it because their model has the potential to affect a population, even if it's just a tiny slice of the population. Because in the United States, only about 70,000 voters in 3 states decided the election.
So David Carroll teaches software design at Parsons. He sued to try to get his data back from Cambridge Analytica. What happened to his data?
Well, it's inside Cambridge Analytica's servers, which the Information Commissioner in Britain, which is a job which doesn't exist here in the United States because you have no data protection laws. Bad luck. So we do, and it turned out that quite a lot of what Cambridge Analytica had got up to was actually illegal, and what Facebook had done was illegal. And in this very dramatic moment, in the week after we published the story about Christopher Wiley, the Information Commissioner went in with a warrant and seized Cambridge Analytica's servers. And so they have this vast, vast amount of data they've been trying to look at. And in there somewhere is David Carroll's data. And they're doing a final report we're not quite sure exactly when, but in a few months. Okay. And David Carroll, apparently there is some data that they're going to be able to get back to him. And that's going to be really, really interesting, because if you think that Cambridge Analytica boasted that they had data on 230 million Americans. So pretty much they had all of your data too. And it's just fascinating, because you've got no access to that at all. And this, what credit card companies know about you, what magazines, you had some of it, didn't you? Yeah. There's this vast trove that can be used to create these profiles, and there is no way here in this country you can find out what that is. And it was just this sort of amazing loophole that actually the data was being processed in Britain. So David Carroll had rights under our laws.
And Carroll had introduced me to David when I met her. She was like, at the time, this is the thing about technology, is that it is a double-edged sword, right? At the one side, we're seeing all the dystopia that we've been talking about, but the other side, we saw people in the making of this film who were using technology to kind of hack the system back, right? Like all these people who we call them the Digital Justice League. They were people with different skill sets who were finding each other on Twitter and were obsessed with this Cambridge Analytica story. And each person had a different skill set. Each person was giving another clue. And all these people were citizens. No one was getting paid for this work. And they were instrumental in bringing this story to light. And David was one of them. And for those of you who haven't seen the movie, we follow David Carroll because he's kind of this, everyman person who's asking the fundamental question, do I have the right to know what you know about me? Can I get my data back? Because Cambridge was boasting at the time that they had 5,000 data points on every single voter, right? And he wanted to know if he'd been targeted, and the answer was he had no rights in the United States. Yeah. And by connecting with Ravi, who is a lawyer in the UK who specializes in data rights, they were able to find a loophole where you could sue Cambridge Analytica in the UK courts, and because Cambridge had processed American voter data in the UK. So they had to go through this entire loop around, and because in this country, your data is not classified as yours. Now, that decision was probably made not so far from where we're sitting. Right?
Well, but also,
and why was that decision made that way? And that decision hasn't changed.
No, but that's what I want to focus on, because this is not a matter of bad luck. This is not a matter of only what happens in Silicon Valley. It's very much a matter of what happens in Washington. And so I think everybody should also feel empowered to change the laws where they're inadequate, because if we are going to be discouraged to participate in the democratic process and feel like there's nothing we can do, that's terrible. So I really think that people with the knowledge about the technology and the data who care about this and want to do something right is to start pushing for laws that offer data protection, that offer insights to lawmakers on how the technologies work, so that we can build a better resilience of our democracies at times of technological disruptions.
Let me bring the audience in. Twitter stopped accepting political ads. It's interesting. This person asks, should Congress legislate Facebook to follow suit?
Yes.
Next question.
No, but the thing is, I would say but the thing I would say is that won't happen currently. So this has to be public pressure, and the Facebook and Google, before the referendum in Ireland on abortion, it became apparent that there were all these other groups from outside the country placing adverts during that. And so there's a voluntary moratorium on it. Mm-hmm. Google stopped all ads, Facebook stopped all foreign ones. And it's because they recognized that that election was not safe and that the law was going to be broken. And so they took this decision that was the way. And I think in the run-up to 2020, given that you know that your last election was subverted by a hostile foreign power, amongst You know, all sorts of other things went on. You have to really ask, is that impossible next time around? And if it's not, then, you know, this isn't politics, remember. This is national security. And, you know, the thing in America, this debate has to be elevated above Republican and Democrat. And you have no election security at the moment. And, you know, it really is up to you to confront that and to confront these companies and to bring pressure to bear. Because I don't know about you, but the idea that you're going to have another election that you know is not safe. I mean, really, is that really what you want?
You're answering all the questions I have.
Well, I think they're also...
Go ahead.
I would just add that besides the focus on political ads, there has to be a focus on micro-targeting, which involves both the collection of data of individual internet users and then the placing of ads against them. And I think it's very, very tricky to identify exactly what is a political ad. So, you know, all kinds of messages, you know, negative about immigrants or positive about climate change or whatnot are also political in nature, but not necessarily political. So I think the targeting and the collecting of certain data characteristics, which I've heard that it takes only 10 data points to know, you know, within a very, very high likelihood what kind of voter someone is.
Yeah.
So I think the question of is it acceptable to know what, on the basis of search, what people's mental state, sexual orientation, economic positioning, political preferences, I don't know, all kinds of characteristics are, and that they then can be used to influence people. It has a lot to do with this identifying of people as persuadables because they know so much. And I think that model has to be broken beyond the question of political ads only.
But the thing is, you know, to address the people who talk about the First Amendment, right? The First Amendment is an important code that should be protected and preserved, but the First Amendment's also been adapted to the different eras that we live in. You can't sit in this room and watch a movie and yell fire, can you? Right? Because that's against the First Amendment. So we had to change the laws to protect the First Amendment. This idea of an unfiltered First Amendment is a myth that's never existed, and it is being used by Silicon Valley to protect certain perspectives of Facebook. Secondly, I think it's important to remember that, you know, the stakes are getting instrumentally higher as this conversation is happening. And we still have not taken any safeguards with 2020 so close by. And that just is really terrifying to all of us. And I don't know what else needs to happen for people to realize that this is a fundamental threat to our national sovereignty and to our autonomy. And when we look at this issue, because this issue is not just a political ad issue, when we look at it from other lenses, I think it will affect the way you look at it. For example, you talked about people's mental state. Well, we've seen that people can be targeted to make them more neurotic, to increase their neuroticism, to sell them fear. When you look at that from a political ad tech or a First Amendment perspective, you might have one perspective. When you look at it from a mental health lens, you have a very different view of what's acceptable, right? So we have to look at the implications of these actions on our society. Exactly, from multiple lenses as they affect our society. Because this is not just a contained space of how you run a political election. This is a fundamental space of how we interact in these digital realities.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me ask a final question in the context of 2020. Where do the Russians fit? Is it simply Putin hating Clinton, or is the Russian Federation sowing confusion in the West? Are the Russians going to be a player in our election in 2020?
Why wouldn't they? I mean, they did pretty well, didn't they? I mean, you're kind of like, why would you give up now when, you know, well, hasn't it just been such great? I mean...
I thought?
Well, I would say don't let the Russians be too much of a distraction. Look at the problem broadly, systematically, and start from the point of view of the importance of the rule of law and equal treatment of all players who may want to undermine liberal democracy. And unfortunately, there are many.
Thank you. So we have this tradition, we're going to end on, of one word here at Computer History Museum. As part of CHM's One Word Initiative, you were asked to write down one word of advice for an aspiring entrepreneur. Can you share your one word of advice and the story behind why you chose? Pedro, why don't we start with you?
All right. Well, my word is question. And when I embarked on this journey to help tell the story, I didn't even know what questions I should be asking. I didn't know about the data ecosystem and about how my data and everyone's data is being taken and how that's being used. I don't know a lot of the answers, but I learned some of the questions that I needed to ask. And I think broadly I think we all need to question if what we're doing is ethical. Maybe it's not illegal, but is it ethical? And where do our morals and with the pursuit of innovation, where's that pointing us? And they don't have to be mutually exclusive. So,
excellent. Carroll?
I got a bit confused by the question. I don't think I realized that it was advice. So it was the motto here. But anyway, I came up with subversion. And that was my word, because that is what has happened to these platforms. They have been subverted by these bad actors who have tipped your election, have had these fundamental impacts upon elections elsewhere, such as Britain. And I suppose I'm going to use the opportunity to encourage employees in these companies right here in Mountain View and in Silicon Valley. Think subversion. Because we need you. We really, really need insiders coming forward, people who are not okay with what is going on in these companies and who believe that the dangers posed by this unchecked power and this lack of accountability is worth the risk to them personally in shining something of a light. So it was kind of apt in a sort of way. Or I subverted the question.
I also didn't realize that it was advice to entrepreneurs. So my word is fragility. I think this word came to me because I saw the power of technology, in Tahrir Square in Egypt, where I made a film called The Square. And during that time, we saw Twitter became the kind of the news voice for anybody with an iPhone, with a smartphone, being able to reach the whole world and send pictures and send information that could protect those of us who were protesting. And Facebook was this incredible tool, and it became the right to free assembly, and the way in which we could collect and organize each other. And so much of what we accomplished during the early days of that protest movement was fueled by technology. And so we felt that technology was this gift from the gods of the Silicon Valley, people who came from the skies, that they had given us these tools. But very quickly after that, we saw the pendulum of technology swing to the other direction. And these same very tools were in the hands of authoritarian regimes. And people who had been tweeting and had followers were all of a sudden being followed by real people as in special security services and being disappeared. And it wasn't funny anymore. And our technology was being used against us. And we felt a certain fragility that shook us to our core. And we saw how dangerous these technologies could be. So we learned in the Middle East very quickly that the code is often neither good or bad. It depends how it's used. But we never imagined that same fragility at the expense of technology would be felt in Western countries so quickly. Interesting. And what is that fragility? To me, that fragility is a fragility of governments in the face of monopolistic tech platforms, I think there's a fragility of our quote-unquote shared values in an era where everyone is living in their own reality. And I think there's a fragility, ultimately, of the word truth in an era of weaponized information. So I think it's important for any entrepreneur or person to think about the fragilities of humanity that are in their hands as they're designing the next great application of these technologies. And I hope that we can see that we need technology to expand our capacity as humans, but we need ethics to preserve our humanity, and don't give us the false choice between the two.
I don't have too much to add to these brilliant speakers and words. Yes, I know, I'm going to turn it around. Thanks. But I actually thought it should be advice to young people, which entrepreneurs often are. So my word, or rather picture, was heart, and to suggest that people should also follow it and not just think about the next invention and move fast and break things, but also really feel, use the humanity side, and think about the impact on others a little bit more. So.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks, you guys, for your reporting was compelling. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And if one thing we'll say, for any insiders, call Carroll.
Oh, yeah. 1-800 blow the whistle.
Yeah, right here.
Call Carroll.